In the annals of American justice, there are moments that transcend law and touch the very soul of humanity. Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom in Providence, Rhode Island, has witnessed countless such moments, but none quite like what happened on a cold November morning when a homeless veteran walked through those doors carrying more than just a citation. He carried the weight of a nation's broken promises and his own shattered dreams. The man who would soon move an entire courtroom to stunned silence was 63-year-old Robert "Bobby" Mitchell, a Vietnam War veteran who had once proudly served his country in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But the Bobby Mitchell who stood in Judge Caprio's courtroom bore little resemblance to the young soldier who had answered his nation's call over 4 decades earlier. His clothes were worn and weathered, his beard unkempt, his eyes carrying the hollow look of someone who had seen too much and lost too much along the way. Bobby clutched a sleeping violation citation in his weathered hands, a ticket for the crime of having nowhere to go, for the offense of existing without a roof over his head in a society that had seemingly forgotten those who had given everything in its service. It was a $25 fine that might as well have been $25,000 for a man whose entire worldly possessions fit in a tattered backpack slung over his shoulder. Judge Frank Caprio had built his reputation on seeing beyond the surface of each case that came before him. While other judges might see traffic violations and municipal infractions, he saw human stories, personal struggles, and opportunities for compassion to triumph over bureaucracy. But even with his decades of experience in reading people, in understanding the pain behind their legal troubles, nothing could have prepared him for what Bobby Mitchell was about to share. The courtroom that morning was filled with the usual mix of defendants, people facing parking tickets, moving violations, and minor infractions that brought them into contact with the municipal court system. Most expected their cases to be routine proceedings, quick interactions with justice that would result in fines paid or community service assigned. None of them realized they were about to witness something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Bobby Mitchell had been homeless for 3 years, ever since a perfect storm of circumstances had stripped away everything he had worked to build after returning from Vietnam. The details of his descent from homeowner to street dweller were painfully common among veterans of his generation. Untreated trauma, struggles with alcohol, job loss, medical bills, and a support system that failed him when he needed it most. But the story he was about to tell Judge Caprio would reveal something far more profound than just another tale of veteran homelessness. The previous night, Bobby had taken shelter in the doorway of a closed downtown business, trying to escape the bitter November wind that cut through his inadequate jacket like a knife through paper. It wasn't the first time he had slept in that particular doorway, and he had always been careful to leave before the business opened, to clean up after himself, to remain invisible in the way society demanded of people like him. But this time, his exhaustion had overwhelmed his caution. When the police officer found him that morning, Bobby didn't argue or resist. He had been through this routine before: the citation, the court date, the fine he couldn't pay, the cycle that kept spinning without offering any real solution to the underlying problem. He folded the ticket carefully and put it in his pocket, gathered his few belongings, and shuffled away to find somewhere else to spend the day until evening came and he would need to find another doorway, another temporary refuge from the elements and the world's indifference. What the officer who wrote that ticket didn't know, what the system that processed it couldn't see, what even Bobby himself might not have fully understood at the time, was that this particular citation would become the catalyst for a moment of truth that would expose the deep contradictions in how America treats its veterans. It would become the vehicle through which one man's story would illuminate the struggles of hundreds of thousands of others who had served their country only to find themselves abandoned by it. Judge Caprio's approach to justice had always been guided by a simple principle: every person who appeared before him was a human being first, a defendant second. He believed that understanding the story behind the citation was more important than simply processing the paperwork. But as Bobby Mitchell approached the bench that morning, even this experienced judge, who had heard thousands of stories of hardship and struggle, could not have anticipated the emotional journey he was about to embark upon. The courtroom fell into its usual rhythm as cases were called and processed. Traffic violators explained their circumstances, parking offenders pleaded their cases, and Judge Caprio listened with his characteristic blend of authority and compassion. But there was something different in the air that morning, a sense that something significant was about to happen, though no one could have predicted what form that significance would take. When Bobby Mitchell's name was called, the slight figure that rose from the back of the courtroom seemed almost to disappear among the other defendants. But as he made his way to the front, walking with the careful dignity of a man who had learned to navigate the world with little margin for error, those who noticed him saw something in his bearing that spoke of a different kind of strength, the quiet resilience of someone who had endured more than most people could imagine. Bobby Mitchell's journey to that Providence courtroom had begun 45 years earlier in a small farming town in Ohio, where he had grown up as the youngest of 4 children in a family that believed deeply in service to country and community. His father had served in World War II, his older brother in Korea, and when Bobby turned 18 in 1968, the Vietnam War was raging and young men across America were being called to serve. Unlike many of his generation who sought deferments or fled to Canada, Bobby Mitchell enlisted voluntarily, driven by the same sense of duty that had shaped his family for generations. Private First Class Robert Mitchell arrived in Vietnam in January 1969, assigned to the 25th Infantry Division, operating in the dangerous regions around Cu Chi and Tay Ninh. He was 19 years old, barely out of high school, carrying letters from his girlfriend Susan and photos of his family tucked inside his helmet. Like so many young soldiers, he believed he was fighting for freedom and democracy, that his sacrifice would be honored and remembered, that his country would take care of him when he came home. The reality of Vietnam hit Bobby like a sledgehammer from his first day in country. The heat, the humidity, the constant threat of enemy fire, the horror of watching friends die in ways that would haunt his nightmares for decades to come. But Bobby adapted, as soldiers do. He became a squad leader, earned a Bronze Star for bravery, and somehow managed to keep his humanity intact even as the war tried to strip it away piece by piece. The incident that would define the rest of Bobby's life happened on his second tour, during a search and destroy mission in a village outside Tay Ninh. Intelligence had suggested the village was harboring Viet Cong fighters, but when Bobby's squad arrived, they found mostly women, children, and elderly farmers. The rules of engagement were unclear, tensions were high, and in the chaos that followed, civilians were killed. Bobby tried to stop it, tried to protect an elderly Vietnamese man who reminded him of his grandfather, but he was too late. The old man died in his arms, and something inside Bobby Mitchell died with him. Bobby came home in 1971 to a country that seemed to have forgotten there was still a war going on. There were no parades, no welcome home ceremonies, no recognition of what he and millions of other veterans had endured. Instead, there was indifference at best, hostility at worst. His girlfriend Susan had moved on, married someone who hadn't gone to war. His job at the local factory had been filled. The GI Bill helped him get through college, but the nightmares, the flashbacks, the guilt over what he had seen and done, followed him everywhere. For 20 years, Bobby managed to build something resembling a normal life. He worked as a machinist, married a patient woman named Carol who tried to understand his demons, bought a small house with a white picket fence and a garage where he could work on cars. They never had children. Bobby was too afraid of what kind of father his war experiences might make him. But they were content, or at least Carol was, and Bobby learned to live with the constant background noise of trauma that never quite went away. The unraveling began slowly, then accelerated with devastating speed. Carol developed breast cancer and died after a 3-year battle that drained their savings and Bobby's emotional reserves. Without her steady presence, the nightmares came back worse than ever. Bobby started drinking heavily, missing work, isolating himself from the few friends who tried to help. The factory where he had worked for 15 years downsized, and at 58, Bobby found himself unemployed with few prospects and a growing alcohol problem. The house went first, lost to medical bills and missed mortgage payments. Then the car, repossessed when Bobby couldn't make the payments. Then his dignity, as he found himself moving from friend's couch to friend's couch until even the most patient of them could no longer handle his drinking and erratic behavior. By the time Bobby Mitchell found himself living on the streets of Providence, he had lost everything except his military ID card and the Bronze Star medal he kept in a small velvet box in his backpack. 3 years of homelessness had taught Bobby harsh lessons about survival and invisibility. He learned which shelters were safe and which were dangerous, which police officers would move him along quietly and which would arrest him for the crime of existing. He learned to make himself small, to avoid eye contact, to fade into the urban landscape like a ghost. Most of all, he learned that the country he had served, the society he had fought to protect, had no place for broken veterans like him. The night before his court appearance, Bobby had slept fitfully in that downtown doorway, dreaming again of the old Vietnamese man who had died in his arms 50 years earlier. He woke with tears on his cheeks and the man's face fresh in his memory, as clear as if the incident had happened yesterday instead of decades ago. It was a sign, Bobby thought, though he wasn't sure of what. All he knew was that something felt different about this day, something that made him hope, despite everything he had learned about hope being a luxury he couldn't afford. As Bobby sat in the courtroom waiting for his name to be called, he thought about the words he might say to Judge Caprio. Not an excuse or a sob story. Bobby Mitchell had too much pride for that. But maybe an explanation, a way to help this judge understand that the man before him wasn't just another homeless vagrant, but someone who had once mattered, who had served with honor, who deserved better than sleeping in doorways and being cited for the crime of having nowhere else to go. Robert Mitchell, the court clerk called, and Bobby rose slowly from his seat in the back of the courtroom. Every step toward Judge Caprio's bench felt like a mile, his worn boots making soft sounds against the polished floor that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. The other defendants and spectators turned to look at him, and Bobby felt their eyes taking in his appearance. The threadbare coat, the unkempt beard, the unmistakable markers of homelessness that made him visible in all the wrong ways. Judge Caprio looked up as Bobby approached, and their eyes met for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. In that brief exchange of glances, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of one human being by another. Judge Caprio had seen thousands of defendants over his decades on the bench, but there was something about this man that commanded attention, a dignity that seemed to shine through despite his circumstances. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying its characteristic warmth. "I see you're here about a sleeping violation. Can you tell me what happened?" It was a simple question, asked in the same gentle tone he used with every defendant, but Bobby heard something in it that he hadn't heard in years. Genuine interest, the sense that someone was actually listening. Bobby cleared his throat, his voice rusty from disuse and emotion. "Your Honor, I was sleeping in a doorway downtown. I know it's against the law, and I'm not here to make excuses. I had nowhere else to go." The words came out quietly, but they carried a weight that filled the courtroom. This wasn't the defensive posturing or elaborate excuse-making that often characterized these proceedings. This was simple, honest truth. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from professional attention to something deeper. "Mr. Mitchell, tell me about yourself. What's your story?" The question caught Bobby off guard. In 3 years of interactions with police, social workers, and various officials, no one had ever asked him about his story. They saw the surface, homeless, vagrant, problem to be managed, but never the person underneath. "I'm a veteran, Your Honor. I served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 25th Infantry Division." Bobby's voice grew stronger as he spoke these words, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away. He stood a little straighter, his shoulders squaring with the memory of who he used to be. "I came home in 1971, and I tried to build a life. I really did. But sometimes—" His voice trailed off as he struggled to find words for experiences that had no adequate language. The courtroom had grown completely silent. Even the usual background noise of shuffling papers and whispered conversations had stopped. Everyone present seemed to sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary, though they couldn't yet define what it was. Judge Caprio waited patiently, giving Bobby the space to find his words. "Sometimes the war doesn't end when you come home," Bobby continued, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the room. "Sometimes it follows you for 50 years, and no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try to forget, it's always there. In your dreams, in the sound of helicopters, in the faces of strangers who remind you of people who died in your arms." Judge Caprio's eyes had begun to glisten with unshed tears. As a man of Italian heritage who had grown up in an era when military service was considered sacred duty, the judge had deep respect for veterans. But more than that, as someone who had dedicated his life to seeing the humanity in every person who came before his bench, he could hear the profound pain in Bobby's words. "I lost my wife to cancer 3 years ago," Bobby went on, his voice growing more steady as he spoke. She was the only thing that kept me tethered to the world, the only person who could quiet the noise in my head. When she died, I started drinking more, and the drinking cost me my job, and losing my job cost me my house, and losing my house cost me everything else. Before I knew it, I was living on the streets, and I've been there ever since." The judge sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what he had just heard. Around the courtroom, people were wiping away tears, moved by the raw honesty of Bobby's account. But Bobby wasn't finished. He reached into his backpack with trembling hands and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. "Your Honor, I want to show you something," he said, opening the box to reveal his Bronze Star medal. The metal had lost some of its luster over the years, but it still caught the courtroom lights as Bobby held it up. "I earned this for bravery in combat. I saved 3 men from a burning helicopter, and I got this medal for it. But I couldn't save my marriage when the nightmares got too bad. I couldn't save my job when the drinking got out of control. I couldn't save my home when the bills piled up. I couldn't even save my wife from cancer." Bobby's voice broke on these last words, and the tears he had been holding back finally came. "I've been thinking a lot lately about what bravery really means. Is it running into enemy fire to save your buddies? Or is it getting up every morning when you have nothing to live for and trying to make it through another day? Is it carrying a rifle through the jungle? Or is it carrying 50 years of guilt and shame and still trying to be a decent human being?" The courtroom was completely still now, the silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Judge Caprio sat motionless, tears streaming down his cheeks as he listened to this broken man lay bare his soul. The other defendants, the court officers, the clerks, everyone present seemed frozen in place, afraid that any movement might shatter the sacred moment they were witnessing. "I know sleeping in that doorway was wrong," Bobby concluded, his voice now steady despite his tears. "But Your Honor, I just need you to know that I'm not just some homeless bum. I was somebody once. I served my country with honor. I was a husband, a friend, a productive member of society. I know I don't look like much now, but there's still some of that man left inside me, and I thought maybe you should know that before you decide what to do with me." The silence that followed Bobby Mitchell's words was unlike anything Judge Frank Caprio had ever experienced in his courtroom. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet that sometimes accompanied difficult cases, or the tense stillness that preceded harsh sentences. This was something else entirely, a reverent hush that seemed to acknowledge the sacred nature of what had just been shared. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. Judge Caprio sat perfectly still, his hands folded in front of him, tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. In 3 decades on the bench, he had heard thousands of stories, witnessed every form of human struggle and triumph that found its way into a municipal courtroom. But Bobby Mitchell's words had reached something deeper than professional compassion. They had touched the very core of his humanity, the part of him that understood what it meant to carry burdens too heavy for one person to bear. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, barely controlled. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that felt inadequate to the moment. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Bobby. May I call you Bobby?" The veteran nodded, surprised by the informality, the sudden shift from defendant to human being. "Bobby, I want you to know that you are still somebody. You are still that man who served his country with honor. You are still that husband who loved his wife. You are still that soldier who earned that Bronze Star for bravery." The judge paused, removing his glasses to wipe away tears that refused to stop flowing. Around the courtroom, there wasn't a dry eye to be found. Court officers who had seen it all, clerks who processed hundreds of cases a week, defendants waiting their turn, all were openly weeping as they witnessed this extraordinary moment of human connection. "You asked me what bravery really means," Judge Caprio continued, his voice growing stronger. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Bobby. I see a man who has endured more pain than most of us can imagine, who has lost everything that mattered to him, who wakes up every morning on the cold streets of the city with no reason to hope, and yet still gets up. Still tries. Still maintains his dignity and his decency despite a world that has seemingly forgotten him. That, sir, is the truest bravery I have ever witnessed." Bobby's legs began to shake, and he gripped the edge of the defendant's podium to steady himself. No one had spoken to him this way in years. No one had seen him as anything more than a problem to be managed, or a nuisance to be moved along. To hear his pain acknowledged, his struggles validated, his humanity recognized, it was almost too much to bear. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. "Bobby, I'm going to dismiss this citation completely. There will be no fine, no penalty, no mark against your record. Because a man who served his country the way you did, who sacrificed the way you have, should never be criminalized for the simple act of seeking shelter." The judge's voice was rising now, filled with righteous indignation on Bobby's behalf. The fact that a decorated combat veteran is sleeping in doorways in this country is not a failure of character, it's a failure of society. The judge stood up from his bench, something he rarely did during proceedings, and the symbolic weight of the gesture was not lost on anyone present. "Bobby, I want you to know that your service mattered. Your sacrifice mattered. The fact that you're still here, still fighting to survive each day, still treating others with respect despite how you've been treated, all of that matters. You matter." Through his tears, Bobby managed to whisper, "Thank you, Your Honor. You don't know what it means to hear someone say that." Judge Caprio wasn't done. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, but then seemed to reconsider. Instead, he turned to address the entire courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard here today is the story of one man, but it represents the stories of thousands of veterans across this country who are struggling on our streets. Men and women who answered their nation's call, who served with honor, who came home to a society that too often ignores their sacrifice and abandons them in their time of need." The judge's voice carried the weight of moral authority as he continued. "We live in a country where we thank veterans for their service with our words, but too often fail to back up those words with actions. Where we honor the flag and the uniform in parades and ceremonies, but look the other way when the men and women who wore that uniform are sleeping under bridges and in doorways." By now, several people in the courtroom were standing, moved by the judge's passionate defense of Bobby and all veterans like him. What had started as a routine municipal court hearing had transformed into something unprecedented, a moral reckoning, a call to conscience that reached beyond the walls of that courtroom. "Bobby," Judge Caprio said, turning his attention back to the veteran, "I'm going to do more than just dismiss your citation. I'm going to make some calls. There are resources available for veterans, programs designed to help men like you get back on your feet. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but you don't have to do this alone anymore." The judge reached into his pocket again and this time pulled out a business card, writing something on the back. "This is my personal contact information. I want you to call me in 1 week, and I want you to tell me how you're doing. This isn't the end of our conversation, Bobby. It's the beginning." As Judge Caprio handed Bobby the card, their hands touched briefly, and in that moment, something passed between them that transcended the formal boundaries of judge and defendant. It was a recognition of shared humanity, an acknowledgement that sometimes the most important work of justice happens not in the application of law, but in the recognition of dignity and worth. The transformation in Bobby Mitchell didn't happen overnight, but it began the moment he walked out of Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom carrying more than just a dismissed citation. He carried with him something he hadn't possessed in years: hope. Not the desperate, fleeting kind that comes from finding a warm place to sleep for the night, but the deep, sustaining hope that comes from being truly seen and valued by another human being. For the first time in 3 years, Bobby Mitchell felt like he might actually have a future worth fighting for. True to his word, Judge Caprio made those promised phone calls before Bobby had even left the courthouse. Within hours, the judge had connected with the Rhode Island Veterans Administration, local housing authorities, and several non-profit organizations dedicated to helping homeless veterans. He didn't just make referrals, he personally advocated for Bobby, using his influence and reputation to cut through bureaucratic red tape that might have taken months to navigate. The video of Bobby's court appearance, like so many of Judge Caprio's most powerful moments, quickly went viral. But this one struck a particularly deep chord with viewers around the world. Military families, veterans organizations, and ordinary citizens who had never served in combat but understood the moral obligation to care for those who had, shared Bobby's story millions of times. The comment sections overflowed with people sharing their own stories of veteran family members, their outrage at how society treats those who served, and their admiration for Judge Caprio's compassionate response. Within a week of the video's release, Bobby's life began to change in ways he never could have imagined. Donations poured in from strangers who had been moved by his story, not just money, but practical offers of help. A local veterans organization provided him with temporary housing while he navigated the process of applying for permanent supportive housing through the VA. A barbershop owner offered him free services to help him prepare for job interviews. A mental health counselor who specialized in treating combat trauma reached out to offer pro bono services. But perhaps most importantly, Bobby began connecting with other veterans who had faced similar struggles. Through support groups and informal gatherings, he discovered he wasn't alone in his battle with the invisible wounds of war. He met other men and women who understood the weight of survivor's guilt, the exhaustion of hypervigilance, the challenge of reintegrating into a civilian world that couldn't comprehend what they had experienced. For the first time in decades, Bobby began to understand that his struggles weren't a sign of personal failure, but symptoms of trauma that many veterans carried. The phone call Bobby made to Judge Caprio a week after their court encounter was emotional for both men. Bobby's voice was stronger, filled with a tentative optimism that hadn't been there before. He reported that he had secured temporary housing, had his first appointment with a VA counselor, and was working with a case manager to address his various needs. But more than the practical progress, what struck Judge Caprio was the change in Bobby's spirit. There was life in his voice again, a sense of possibility that had been absent during their first meeting. Judge Caprio, for his part, was profoundly affected by the encounter with Bobby Mitchell. In interviews following the viral video, the judge spoke passionately about the moral crisis represented by veteran homelessness. He used his platform to advocate for policy changes, increased funding for veteran services, and a fundamental shift in how society views and treats those who have served. The case had reminded him why he had chosen to approach justice with compassion, because behind every citation, every violation, every legal proceeding was a human being deserving of dignity and understanding. 6 months later, Bobby Mitchell returned to Judge Caprio's courtroom, but this time as a visitor, not a defendant. Clean-shaven, dressed in clothes that fit properly, with clear eyes and a genuine smile, he was almost unrecognizable as the broken man who had stood before the bench that November morning. He had secured permanent housing through a veterans program, was attending regular counseling sessions to address his trauma, and had even found part-time work helping other homeless veterans navigate the complex system of available services. The reunion between Bobby and Judge Caprio was captured on camera and shared widely, providing a hopeful conclusion to a story that had touched millions. But for those who knew the deeper reality of veteran homelessness and trauma recovery, Bobby's progress represented something even more significant. Proof that with the right support, understanding, and advocacy, even the most damaged among us can find their way back to dignity and purpose. Bobby's story became part of Judge Caprio's regular speaking engagements, a powerful example of how the justice system can be a force for healing rather than punishment when it chooses to see defendants as complete human beings rather than just case numbers. The judge would often conclude these presentations by reading from letters he received from other veterans inspired by Bobby's story to seek help, or from family members who had gained new understanding of their loved ones' struggles. The sleeping citation that had brought Bobby Mitchell to Judge Caprio's courtroom represented, in many ways, society's failure to care for its veterans. But the judge's response to Bobby's story demonstrated something equally powerful: the capacity for individual compassion to spark broader change, for one person's willingness to truly listen to transform not just a single life but an entire community's understanding of its obligations to those who served. In the years that followed, Bobby became an advocate himself, working with local organizations to help other homeless veterans. He would often tell his story at VA hospitals and veteran gatherings, emphasizing that recovery was possible but required both personal determination and community support. His message was simple but profound: every veteran's service mattered, every veteran's struggle was valid, and no veteran should have to face the battles of civilian life alone. The courtroom where Bobby Mitchell once stood as a defendant had become something more than a place where municipal violations were processed. It had become a symbol of what justice could look like when it was guided by compassion, understanding, and respect for human dignity. And Bobby Mitchell, the homeless veteran whose words had left Judge Caprio in tears and rendered the court completely silent, had become living proof that redemption and healing were always possible, even in the darkest of circumstances, when someone cares enough to truly listen and act on what they hear.